Imagine Thomas Merton traveling a well-worn footpath leading to the Hermitage. As he approaches the Hermitage, he spies a group of visitors. What follows is one of the more humorous incidents I associate with his life. They've come to see a caged hermit on exhibit. Prey spots them first. What does he do? Does he rush to greet his visitors? No, he hides. In his March 15, 1968 journal, he writes, "Went out again to my small west pond and did some zen. It was right. When I came back, I saw two cars waiting at my gate. I hid in the cedars until three priests appeared. Disappointed, they drove off, and I returned to the Hermitage." Merton's experience of a fight to defend solitude is not unique. On Easter Sunday afternoon, April 20, 2020, I found myself circling the parking lot of the Piedmont Nature Center in High Point, North Carolina. All the parking spots were occupied. Children and adults crisscrossed the pavement as they raced to enter the park. Well, in early spring, prior to the pandemic, it was not unusual to find open spaces. And in the summer, one had no competition for a place to park for a solitary walk in the woods. Now there was a great deal of competition. In the COVID-19 pandemic, solitary spaces that normally promise quiet or contemplation were suddenly overcrowded. In the quarantine that accompanied the 2020 COVID pandemic, we were required to engage in social distancing. At the height of the pandemic, churches and public assemblies were asked to discontinue open meetings until further notice. But people weren't really that isolated. Phones began to buzz, social media posts were on the uprise, synchronous meetings on Zoom and Teams began to proliferate. And as the daily schedule of meetings filled and overflowed, my thoughts turned to Merton and his confrontation with the phenomenon of the overcrowding of solitude. This essay deals with the phenomenon of the overcrowding of solitude. One, Merton's objective struggle with the overcrowding of solitude. Merton entered the monastery, and it afforded him the opportunity to pursue a life of solitude. His vows of stability, his pledge of stability and obedience would place him at the mercy of his superiors when confronted with requests to travel or to go to retreats. These vows created an objective hedge around Merton, isolating him from the world of Columbia University and elsewhere. Since he entered the Trappist monastery, the rule of silence would produce even more solitude for him. In Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, Merton says, solitude is to be preserved, not as a luxury, but as a necessity, not for perfection so much as for simple survival in the life God has given you. But Merton very soon undermined this project of solitude by his own efforts. As a writer driven to write, he was guilty of having written his own story and submitted it for publication, The Seven-Story Mountain. Readers know he paid a high price for popularity. Within months, he'd become a literary notoriety. And soon the Hermitage and the hermit would feel the pressure of that. Romantic youth would present themselves on the monastery to take their vows. And the swell of novices would tax resources of the monastery, and it would tax Merton's solitude in unexpected ways. Not only that, but the publication of his biography drew in correspondence that came by boatboats, obligating him to respond. Merton had the foresight to anticipate the problem of popularity, even if he didn't have the foresight to see that it would result in an influx of initiates wanting to become monks. Their flirtations with the monastic life and solitude would place his own solitude at risk. Thinking metaphorically, he saw this as if this were the colonization of the desert. Merton wouldn't deny others their solitude, but he understood their quest was likely to infringe upon his quest for solitude as if it were a rare and finite resource. In Signs of Jonah, 1952, The Sign of Jonah, he writes, "In this age of crowds in which I have determined to become a solitary, perhaps the greatest sin would be to lament the presence of people on the threshold of my solitude. Can I be so blind as to be ignorant that solitude is itself their greatest need? And yet, if they rush in upon the deserts in thousands, how shall they be alone?" Perhaps no true scholar is going to argue with this, but as I'm presenting this, I see three stages of his attempts to retreat to an objective solitude. Merton's resort to the woods and nature provided a first and constant source of solitude. To enter the woods for contemplation rather than work must have been something he petitioned his abbot about. And eventually he would wear down the abbot and get to those times when he could walk in the woods. In Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he writes, "A spring morning alone in the woods, sunrise, the enormous yoke of energy spreading and spreading as if to take over the entire sky, after the ceremonies of the birds feeding in the wet grass. How absolutely central is the truth that we are, first of all, part of nature, though we are a very special part, that which is conscious of God." Those who take these words quite literally see him seeking an objective place for solitude. And he still wants more. In his reach for solitude, Merton found a convenient tool shed where he could escape from rain and society to cultivate this solitude. On February 9, 1953, Merton writes in his journal, "St. Anne's is like a rampart between two existences. On one side, I know the community to which I must return. On the other side is a great wilderness of silence in which perhaps I might never speak again to anyone but God as long as I live." And a week later, he writes, "It seems to me St. Anne's is what I've been looking for and waiting for all my life. And now I've stumbled into it quite by accident." 5 years later, he writes, "How rich for me has been the silence of this little house, which is nothing more than a tool shed." He claims that St. Anne's was what he wanted all of his life. Here, he had to contend with the noise of the earth movers in the background and the tractors, and that still was not enough solitude. He had the walks, he had St. Anne's, but he wanted more, and he wanted a place to visit which would be a hermitage. By May 1963, a small retreat center was built, and as he writes to Sister Teresa Linford on May 1, 1963, he reports his excitement that he can go there for a retreat. He begs that she pray for him for this retreat and that he can spend more hours. He begins this love affair with hermitage, and it progresses rapidly. And he spends his time there. His famous essay, The Day of a Stranger, describes a day at the hermitage. Merton is elated to spend his 50th birthday, January 31, 1965, at this hermitage. He's withdrawn from the hubbub of the city, the banter of the community. He's placed himself alone in nature where he spends nights feeling the raw cold of a Kentucky winter. He writes, "But what more do I seek than this silence, this simplicity, living together with wisdom? For me, there is nothing else. Last night before going to bed, realized what solitude really means. When the ropes are cast off, the skiff is no longer tied to the land, but heads out to sea without ties, without restraint." All of these are attempts to reach an objective solitude. But two, Merton struggles with the subjective overcrowding of solitude. Fame is not a tangible object to place in a bank vault, but it is an intersubjective phenomenon that can interrupt solitude. Train of consciousness can lead one away from solitude. Romantic longings can lead one away from solitude. And what of freedom? Perhaps it is the most subtle threat to solitude after one's begun a disciplined life. Merton recognized the value of solitude, and he took increasing steps to preserve that space. He experienced a common desire, the desire to get away, to escape, to be freed from one's social relations and obligations. The desire to get away to nowhere is a desire put down by routine, put down by flight into the many obligations and attachments of life. Merton fed the desire to get away to nowhere with silence and solitude. There are objective threats and there are practical ways to defend, but there are also subjective threats to silence and solitude arising from within. If solitude and silence are spiritual goods, how does one defend those? Merton found counsel in the writings of St. John, the Council of Zen. Certainly, he was familiar with all of these traditions of meditation. But as he turns to St. John of the Cross, he looks at him as someone who could sit upon a hill and speak from the position of someone who knew what enlightenment and was beyond. And one supposes Merton, too, is speaking from knowing. Merton speaks figuratively when he says solitude has to be objective and concrete. Subjective experience of solitude was for him an objective reality. It transcended the finitude of place. It was nowhere. His love for solitude is evident in thoughts in solitude. Merton says, to love solitude and to seek it does not mean constantly traveling from one geographic place to another. A man becomes a solitary at the moment when, no matter what may be his external surroundings, he's suddenly aware of his own inalienable solitude and sees that they will never be anything but solitary. Some label it a train of consciousness, others call it a monkey mind. Merton knew that there is a layer of consciousness beyond sensible impressions that can invade and preoccupy consciousness. Merton says, quote, "There's a darkness that comes when I close my eyes. Here's where big blue, purple, green, and gray fish swim. Most beautiful and peaceful darkness. It's a cave of my own inward being. In this water cave, I easily live whenever I wish." But he knew that he needed to press beyond that through the dark night of the soul. And he often resorted to St. John of the Cross for counsel to do so. We can speak about methods of meditation as a technical overcrowding and solitude. He did not resort to technical methods to get himself to solitude and silence. He found in Zen an identification with the ontological immediacy that defies the phenomenological bifurcation of experience into subject and object. Merton said, the Zen experience is a direct grasp of the unity of the invisible and the visible, the noumenal and the phenomenal, or if you prefer, an experiential realization that any such division is bound to be pure imagination. And then he'll return to thoughts of St. John on the Cross. A spiritual guide worth his salt will conduct a ruthless campaign against all forms of delusion arising out of self-ambition and self-complacency, which aim to establish the ego in spiritual glory. That's why St. John of the Cross is so hostile to visions, ecstasies, and all forms of special experience. Third, lessons learned from Merton's preservation of solitude. Merton knew that his crowds could easily penetrate this objective solitude. The siren song of the world and imagination could disrupt his solitude. But he found ways to safeguard this. First, solitude that is safeguarded may open a pilgrimage to nowhere. In The Sign of Jonah, Merton writes, once God's called you to solitude, everything you touch leads you to further solitude. Everything that affects you builds you into hermit. As long as you do not insist on doing the work yourself and building your own kind of hermitage. Merton understood that perfect solitude is neither attainable nor necessarily desirable. In his early 68 tour in the Southwest and Alaska, he's still looking and searching for some place to be in solitude and silence. Solitude is, among other things, a confrontation with fear of loneliness, and he well understands this. In The Day of a Stranger, he asked, and then he answered this question, do you get lonely? Yes, sometimes. Merton demonstrated this appetite for solitude that would grow, and in a search for solitude, he says, contemplating being in that moment, high up in the sky, I watch the silent flight of a vulture, and the day goes by in prayer. This solitude confirms my call to solitude. The more I'm in it, the more I love it. But now, lest we say, as the speaker said last night, this is introspective navel gazing. Second, Merton knew safeguarding solitude from the overcrowding could lead to a discovery of the social self. He knew the mantra of the pilgrim. He knew the many methods of aesthetic practices, but he didn't compile a list of contemplating techniques. His volumes of directed meditation do not begin with numbered deep breathing exercises. Merton sought silence and solitude, and in that search, he struggled with the phenomenon of the overcrowding of solitude. But consider these statements. The psalmist says, I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is turned to wax. It is melted within me. St. John on the Cross. The soul, at the sight of its miseries, feels that it's melting away and being undone by a cruel spiritual death. It feels as if it were swallowed in a beast and being digested in the dark belly, that it suffers an anguish comparable to Jonah's in the belly of the whale. Merton. Lord God of this great night, do you see the woods? Do you hear the rumor of their loneliness? Do you behold their secrecy? Do you remember their solitudes? Do you see my soul is beginning to dissolve like wax in me? What's the meaning of these lines? The psalmist, St. John, Thomas Merton. Dare I say, the wax does not know itself as wax until it knows its form melted away. Third, solitude that is safeguarded may open the way to society with God. In his meditation, what contemplation is not, Merton says, in the end, contemplation suffers the anguish of realizing he no longer knows what God is. There's no such thing as God because God's neither a what nor a thing, but a pure who. He is the thou before whom our inmost I springs into awareness. In the Christian tradition, one doesn't fear private time, since private time is time with God. In the Christian faith, that's a decidedly personal experience. One may be silent before God, and one may be silent with God, and in all, God remains the other. Writing in 1952, Merton says, "You who sleep in my breast are not met with words, but in the emergence of life within life and of wisdom within wisdom. With you, there's no longer any dialogue, any contest, any opposition. You are found in communion." Solitude can become overcrowded objectively and subjectively. This threat to solitude may become more evident in times of stress and social turmoil, as the 2020 pandemic revealed. In the writings of Thomas Merton, one discovers Merton grappling with the phenomenon of the overcrowding of solitude. And one also finds proactive steps Merton took to preserve the sanctity of solitude. Happy is the soul that learns how to preserve the sanctity of solitude.